You thought it was just a dream, but you were wrong. And with other news in Madison County, Kathleen Turner, who disappeared 3 weeks ago, still hasn't been found. Her father, Dale Turner, is under suspicion for her murder and is currently being detained. The police still haven't given any official statement. Just as I thought, nothing has changed. It's still a dump, thought Kathleen as she looked around her childhood home. From the exterior, the house looked in good repair, but the unkept lawn made it clear that her father was having a hard time maintaining the house on his own. It was a shame that she was only visiting under these circumstances. Not long ago, Kathleen had just barely survived an accident where her car had skidded on the road and she had been flown into another lane. Her memory was almost fully recovered, but her legs were still like lifeless pieces of wood. She felt as if she'll be chained to this damned wheelchair for the rest of her life. "You'll have to stay in the house until I can build some ramps." Her father guiltily averted his gaze. She waved it off. There wasn't anywhere she wanted to go anyway. When her father left, Kathleen took a look around her old room. Surprisingly, everything was where she had left it. Recalling her childhood memories always left Kathleen with a vague feeling of anxiety. Her eyes fell on a large dollhouse. The plastic had become wrinkled and dull with time. The small door was shut closed with duct tape. "I don't remember why, but I never liked playing with that," Kathleen thought to herself. After the accident, she had completely lost her memory. Since then, she's been placing her life together from fragments of memories like a jigsaw puzzle. For example, she still couldn't remember why her room was the only one in the house, with bars and a lock on it. The day went by quickly. Kathleen lay in her bed, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling above. The darkness lay heavily on her chest. It almost felt as if the room had gotten smaller. Suddenly, something flashed in Kathleen's vision. It wasn't difficult finding the light source. It was coming out of the window of the dollhouse. Kathleen felt a chill at the sight of the dollhouse, but curiosity overcame her. She sat upright and reached for her wheelchair. The wheelchair suddenly rolled away from her hand and skidded to the center of the room with unnatural speed. Kathleen quickly pulled her hand back. She felt goosebumps appear on her skin. "Shit! It's just a draft." With this thought, she settled back down in bed, but she could clearly see that the curtains were motionless. No breeze was coming through them. The next day, her father thoughtfully pointed out, "What's wrong, Kat? Did you sleep badly?" Kathleen shook her head and asked why he had installed a light into the dollhouse. Her father raised his bushy eyebrows in confusion. "What are you talking about? I haven't gone into your room since you left." "There was a light coming from a window in the dollhouse last night," she insisted. The father replied that it must have just been a reflection of the moonlight. Kathleen didn't argue with him. Instead, she asked why her window was the only one in the house with bars on it. The preoccupied look on her father's face made her very anxious. "Do you really not remember, Kathleen?" Not waiting for her daughter's response, he pushed his plate back and got up, putting on a tool belt with a distracted look on his face. "We'll talk later. I have to get to work on that ramp." It wasn't difficult to drive her uneasy thoughts away during the day, but once darkness fell, it became much harder for Kathleen to keep her anxiety at bay. The humidity and stuffiness in her room kept Kathleen from sleeping. She closed her eyes and tried to go to doze off, but she was suddenly distracted by the sound of music coming from inside the dollhouse. It was as if the dolls inside had wound up a music box. Kathleen's heart was beating so loudly it almost drowned out the strange melody. Just like the night before, a light shone from the doorhouse window. Kathleen got up from her bed as if hypnotized and sat down in her wheelchair. The moment she sat down, the wheelchair started moving, as if it was being controlled. The wheelchair brought Kathleen to the corner of the room with all her toys and stopped abruptly. Kathleen flew out the wheelchair and fell on the floor. She looked up and saw the dollhouse right in front of her. Its plastic shutters slammed shut with an impossibly loud crash. The melody became warped and unpleasant. A wave of terror came over Kathleen when she heard the sound of children laughter coming from inside the house. This isn't possible. Kathleen's common sense kept repeating in her mind. Her hand moved on its own, reaching for one of the miniature windows. She opened the shutters and gave out a heart-rending scream. A single human eye looked back at her from the doorhouse window. Kathleen would have rushed out of the room if she could, but all she could do was lie helplessly on the floor and scream for help. "Kat! What? Why are you on the floor?" Her father rushed into the room and grabbed her by the shoulders. "There, Dad, there's a person in the dollhouse." The worry on her father's face gave way to disbelief. Both the light in the window and the music had stopped. "Kathleen, do you hear yourself? No one can fit in the dollhouse. It was just a nightmare, just a bad dream like before." Her father suddenly cut himself short, but it was already too late. Kathleen heard what he had said. "Like before?" she repeated. Her father sighed and sat her down in the wheelchair. "You used to have a lot of nightmares as a kid. Like all children, you were afraid of the monster under your bed and thought that all your nightmares were real. Once, you were so scared you tried to climb out of the window, so we had to install bars on the outside. But they were just dreams, nothing more. Right, Kathleen?" She nodded uncertainly. It had all felt so real. But she really wanted to believe her father's version of the story. The next day, Kathleen couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. Her palms would start sweating at the mere thought that tonight she'll see that light from the doorhouse again. She tore the tape of the miniature door and ripped it open to reveal the inside of the doorhouse. She couldn't find anything that could have been the source of the light. All she saw was an idyllic family of dolls, wearing frozen smiles on their faces. Had it all really been a dream? Kathleen's heart skipped a beat when she saw a small, dark, ugly object under one of the miniature beds. It was a doll she had made from cardboard when she was a child. She had been quite good at drawing as a child, but the doll had turned out extremely disproportionate, with huge, bulging eyes and a toothy grin. Kathleen wanted to rip the doll apart, to destroy her. But something made her stop when she saw that the doll had already been slightly torn. She threw the doll into the trash and closed the house back up. That night, Kathleen slept surprisingly well. But her peaceful dream was suddenly interrupted by a hoarse, monotonous voice. There was someone else in the room. Kathleen sat up in her bed. A chill ran down her spine all the way to her motionless feet. A lanky woman was sitting on the floor, her back to Kathleen. She was surrounded by various toys, plastic teacups in front of each of them. The woman was pouring invisible tea into each of the cups and saying something to her guests. "Who's there?" Kathleen managed to get out, overcome with fear. The figure froze and suddenly fell silent. The tea party came to a halt. Kathleen was about to call for her father, but the words got stuck in her throat when the woman suddenly turned around and jumped onto the bed. The creature had enormous, wild eyes and a wide, toothy grin. It would have been a stretch to call her a woman. One of her limbs hung limply, as if torn off, almost like that cardboard doll. "Kathleen," said the creature in a rasping voice, "I missed you so much. Why did you leave me?" Kathleen almost fainted at hearing those words. "Thank you for coming back and freeing me." Kathleen almost forgot how to breathe. "Why is it talking to me? How does it know my name?" she thought frantically. Then a memory suddenly flashed in her mind. A girl who lived under Kathleen's bed. A hideous girl with a toothy grin. Kathleen had been terrified of her. She had been so scared that she had even tried to jump out of the window in an attempt to save herself. Her parents had been convinced that Kathleen was just having nightmares and that they'll stop when she gets older. Kathleen remembered how she had drawn the girl onto a piece of cardboard and locked her in the dollhouse, where she had been waiting patiently for Kathleen's return. Saliva dripped from the creature's large mouth and soaked into the bedsheet. A voice in Kathleen's head was screaming, "Run! Get out of there!" But she couldn't even stand on her own 2 feet, let alone run. All she could think to do was hide under the blanket. Moving slowly with her disfigured limbs, the creature crawled towards Kathleen and sat down on her chest. Kathleen's lungs constricted under the pressure. "This is it. This is the end," thought Kathleen hysterically. But suddenly Kathleen felt light. Somehow she was able to breathe again. Did the creature leave? She carefully got up from under the blanket. The room was empty and quiet. Too quiet. The thought that she had dreamt it all crept into her mind. She couldn't get out of bed. Her wheelchair had disappeared somewhere. Kathleen tried to call for her father, but her voice bounced against the walls and was engulfed by the thick silence in the room. The door opposite the bed slowly opened with a loud creak. The hallway was lit with a blood-red glow. "Dad?" Kathleen asked pitifully, knowing he wasn't going to be there. There was a rumble from deep within the house, and suddenly a strong wind blew into the room from the open door. Kathleen shivered involuntarily. She managed to get down to the floor with some difficulty and crawled out of her room to find her father. That was the only way she was going to get out of this nightmare. Kathleen's voice went hoarse from shouting for her father, but he didn't appear. Finally, she reached the living room. She saw her father sitting on the couch, his back facing her, but he didn't react to any of her shouts. "Dad, why are you—" Kathleen felt her body collapse. What she'd thought had been her father was actually a doll. She hurriedly wiped the tears off her face and looked around. She realized that everything in the house was fake. She was surrounded by brightly colored plastic objects. Utterly confused, Kathleen headed for the window and pulled herself up by the windowsill. Through the window, she saw her room. Her father, who now looked like a giant, was anxiously pacing back and forth. The police were looking around suspiciously and taking notes. Kathleen couldn't hear a word they were saying, but it was clear that they were investigating her disappearance. On the wall above her bed, someone had written, "Now you know how it feels." One of the policemen took a picture of the inscription and asked her father something, but he obviously didn't know anything, because the message was for Kathleen. Her father sat on her bed and covered his face in his hands. Kathleen's arms became weaker. It was getting harder and harder to maintain her grip on the windowsill. She didn't have enough strength to scream either. She just kept whispering for her father to save her. Kathleen felt a sliver of hope, when her father found a small object on her bed and looked right at the dollhouse. He looked at the object in his hand, a cardboard doll that resembled his daughter, and it almost seemed like he understood everything. "I'm here! Help me!" Kathleen yelled with the last of her strength. No longer answering the police's questions, her father got up and headed towards the dollhouse. He looked right at Kathleen, and she thought that she was finally going to be saved. But he just shook his head and tore the doll into small pieces that he then threw into the trash. Kathleen screamed, but the sound never left the dollhouse. No longer able to hold on, Kathleen let go and collapsed into the darkness.